To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
A 38-year-old cold case solved in just 2 days. That's all it took once the right DNA evidence landed in the hands of modern investigators. For the family of 31-year-old Linda Slaten, the wait for justice had stretched across generations. And when the truth finally came out, it shattered everything they thought they knew about trust, safety, and the people closest to them. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 304, The Murder of Linda Slaten. It was the morning of September 4th, 1981, Lakeland, Florida. For Judy Butler, it started like any other day. She lived just a few doors down from her older sister, Linda Slaten, in the same apartment complex. Every morning, the two sisters shared a cup of coffee before starting their days. But that morning, something was different. Judy walked up to her sister's door and knocked, but got no answer. She even called out Linda's name, but still got nothing. At first, she thought maybe Linda had overslept or had already gone to work. But as Judy turned to head back to her own apartment, something caught her eye. The window screen to Linda's bedroom was bent. So instead of continuing to walk back to her own apartment, she decided to get a second look at the window. And when she peered through the glass, she froze. Her sister Linda was lying crosswise on her bed and wasn't moving. Judy's first reaction was that she might be asleep, but then she noticed the way her body was positioned, the sheets disturbed, and something metallic hanging around her neck. And that's when Judy realized something was really, really wrong here. She ran back to her apartment as quickly as she could and called 911. And within minutes, police officers from the Lakeland Police Department were at the scene. Inside, they found 31-year-old Linda Slaten, partially unclothed, strangled with a wire coat hanger. The killer had entered through her bedroom window, but Linda wasn't the only one inside the small apartment. In the living room, Linda's 15-year-old son, Jeff, had been sleeping on a cot when the commotion began. He woke up to flashing lights and voices outside. Officers pulled him aside and told him something that no child should ever have to hear. His mother had been murdered. In the next room, 12-year-old Tim was still asleep. He was confused, scared, unsure why officers were inside of his house. They told him to come out of his room and meet some of the other officers and his brother who were all outside. So 12-year-old Tim did exactly as he was told. He left his bedroom and headed toward the front door. But on his way out, he took a peek in the direction of his mom's bedroom and saw that the door was still closed. And before he could take another step, the door flung open and one of the officers walked out. In that moment, Tim caught a glimpse he would never forget. His mother's body, the coat hanger around her neck, the entire chaos of a crime scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 7 years before her death, Linda Slaten thought she had finally found her peace. In 1974, she divorced her husband, Frank Slaten, a man whose temper and drinking had turned their marriage into years of fear and abuse. Friends later described Frank as controlling and violent, and the divorce left Linda, a single mom in her 20s, raising 2 boys, Jeff and Tim, entirely on her own. So as you can imagine, life after divorce wasn't easy. Money was tight. She didn't have a car and often walked to work. And when she couldn't afford new clothes for the boys, she made them herself. But Linda was determined. Despite everything she had been through, she built a life for her boys inside of that small Lakeland apartment complex. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other, kids rode their bikes until dark, and families helped each other out. One of those neighbors was Coach Joe, a friendly, outgoing man who helped the boys' youth football program. He offered to drive Tim and Jeff to and from practice when Linda couldn't, and sometimes to school as well. To Linda, it felt like a small act of kindness, the sort of favor any good neighbor would do for a struggling single mom. No one could have known what that kindness would lead to. On the night before her murder, September 3rd, 1981, life in the Slaten apartment unfolded like any other. 15-year-old Jeff and his mom had gotten into an argument earlier that evening. It wasn't over anything serious. It was just a typical fight between a mom and a teenager. So after the fight, Jeff grabbed his bicycle and rode across town to his grandparents' house to grab something to eat. Meanwhile, 12-year-old Tim was at football practice. His coach, the same friendly neighbor, Joe, offered to give him a ride home. They pulled up to the apartment sometime in the early evening, and Tim said goodnight to his coach, went inside where his mom was washing dishes. After that, Tim and his mom went next door to a neighbor's house for a small party where they stayed for a bit before returning home. A few hours later, close to midnight, Jeff came home too. But the atmosphere in the apartment had changed from earlier that day. He and his mom made up and everything was back to normal between them. Jeff later told investigators that he remembered standing in the kitchen doorway as his mom finished up the dishes. She smiled and told him that she loved him. He said, "I love you too, Mom. I'll see you tomorrow." That was the last time he ever saw her alive. For investigators, what they found inside of Linda Slaten's apartment was deeply disturbing. Among the first to arrive was Sergeant Edgar Pickett, a seasoned Lakeland police officer just a year away from retirement. Pickett had seen his fair share of violent crime, but this one was different. The brutality, the fact that Linda's two sons had been asleep just down the hall, hit him hard. He would later tell producers of the TV show 48 Hours that it was especially hard for him because he was a father himself. When he got inside the apartment, he carefully examined everything in front of him. He knew from all of his years of experience that the key to solving this murder was likely somewhere in the apartment, so he had to be careful as he went through everything. To Sergeant Pickett, it looked like the killer had entered through Linda's bedroom window. This was the same observation that Linda's sister made when she went over that day. The screen was torn and bent outward. Whoever did this had quietly climbed in through the window. Standing in the middle of the room, Sergeant Pickett worked outward, dusting the entire place for fingerprints. Unless the killer wore gloves, there was a good chance he left a print or two. So he dusted the walls, the doorknobs, even the floor, looking for anything he could find. And on the bedroom windowsill, just beneath where the screen had been pried open, he found something unusual. Not a fingerprint, but a partial palm print. At the time, he had no idea that this single impression, invisible to the naked eye, would become the key to solving the case almost 40 years later. The rest of the scene was documented, photographed, and any evidence they found was collected. Then after that, Linda's body was taken to the medical examiner's office for the autopsy, which confirmed what everyone had feared. Linda had been strangled to death and sexually assaulted. So as soon as it was confirmed that she had been assaulted, the next step was to perform the rape kit, one of the earliest used by the Lakeland PD in the early 1980s. And based on the results, semen was found. But as you can imagine, DNA testing didn't yet exist. So all they could do was collect it, document it, and preserve it for later. And when all was said and done, the evidence told investigators what had happened, but not who done it. Why Linda? Why this mother of two asleep in her own bed in a quiet apartment complex where everyone knew each other? Why Linda Slaten? Right after the murder, Tim and Jeff, Linda's boys, went to go live with their grandparents. And for the first few days, the entire family was scared. The sons would tell 48 Hours that they all slept in the same room together and that their grandfather stayed up all night holding a gun. They had no idea where the killer was going to do next or who was going to be their next victim. So until their mother's killer was caught, they lived their lives on edge. That fear carried well past their childhoods and into adulthood. In the weeks that followed, life slowly tried to return back to normal. The boys eventually went back to school, trying to slip back in a routine that felt familiar. And their classmates and teachers were happy to see them again. And so was their football coach, Coach Joe, who offered sympathy and encouragement. He told them how proud their mother would have been to see them back out there on the football field. That fall, the team gathered for their annual football photo. Tim stood in his uniform, smiling alongside his teammates. A moment meant to capture childhood pride. He later hung that team photo on his bedroom wall. It was taken just a month after his mother's murder. At the same time Linda's sons tried to move on with their lives, detectives were just as busy looking for their suspect. They questioned neighbors, collected statements, and turned their attention to anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. And that's when a few persons of interest emerged. The first was Frank Slaten, Linda's ex-husband. Their marriage had been volatile, marked by years of alcohol abuse and domestic violence. So some might argue that Frank had a clear motive, at least on paper. But investigators quickly determined he was living in Alabama at the time of the murder. He had an alibi that checked out, and despite their troubled history, police couldn't place him anywhere near the apartment that night. They also looked closely at Linda's current boyfriend, a man that she had been casually seeing in the weeks before her death. But he cooperated fully with police and provided his whereabouts for the night of September 3rd. His alibi, too, was also confirmed. So at this point, every promising lead fizzled out. The palm print didn't match anyone in the system. The biological evidence couldn't yet be tested. And despite their best efforts, detectives were left with more questions than answers. No one was charged in Linda's murder. In the earliest days of the investigation, detectives focused hard on 15-year-old Jeff. They knew that he and his mom had argued the night before she was killed, something he never hid from police. And that tension, combined with the fact that he was the last family member to see her alive, made him a prime suspect. So for days, officers pulled Jeff out of school for questioning again and again. He even remembers being told that he was, quote, strong enough to strangle his mother, a comment that has haunted him for decades. But no matter how hard detectives pressed this kid, he pushed back and maintained his innocence. He said he had absolutely nothing to do with his mother's murder. To try and prove that, he even agreed to sit down and take a polygraph test, in which he passed. But the police didn't seem satisfied. They wanted a retest. At this point, his grandparents finally intervened. Enough. This is a teenage boy, for crying out loud, who just lost his mom in a very brutal murder. Leave this kid alone. But 2 weeks later, Jeff gave in. He took a second polygraph. He passed and he was officially cleared. Now, with no other suspects to replace him, momentum bled out of the case. The investigation slowed, then effectively ground to a halt. Time moved on, but for Jeff and Tim Slaten, the pain never really faded. They grew up, started families of their own, and tried to build lives beyond the tragedy that had defined their childhood. But every night, the same questions came back. Why didn't they hear anything? Could we have saved her? Both brothers carried a lot of guilt. guilt for surviving, guilt for not waking up, guilt for being just down the hallway when their mother was killed. And always there was fear, because unless her killer was dead or caught, that meant he was still somewhere out there. Years turned into decades, and during that time, leads came and went. Detectives retired, evidence boxes were moved from one shelf to another. Around the 20th anniversary of the murder, Jeff and Tim met with Lakeland detectives once again. They both volunteered to provide their own DNA samples, hoping to finally clear their names, and perhaps help the investigation in some way. By then, the Lakeland Police Department had already submitted the preserved biological evidence from Linda's rape kit to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, and in early 1999, forensic scientists at FDLE were able to extract and develop a full DNA profile of the unknown killer, a massive leap forward. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, investigators had something solid, a unique genetic fingerprint. All they needed now was a match. Police began collecting DNA samples from everyone who had once been considered a person of interest, including Linda's ex-husband, Frank. Frank had long since quit drinking and was eager to clear his name once and for all. He even voluntarily provided a DNA swab. It didn't match. Neither did anyone else's. The DNA profile sat in the state database waiting for a hit that never came, and once again, the case went cold. In September 2001, investigators chasing new leads received a tip that reignited their hopes. It pointed them to a man named Jimmy Ulmer, a convicted felon whose crimes sounded eerily familiar. Just 1 year after Linda's murder in 1982, Ulmer had broken into a home in Lakeland and attacked a 10-year-old girl, dragging her through her bedroom window in the middle of the night. The child barely survived. Ulmer was caught, convicted, and sentenced to decades behind bars. When detectives dug deeper, they learned that around the same time of Linda's murder, Ulmer had been living in the very same apartment complex, staying with a friend just a few doors away from Linda's unit. It was almost too coincidental. The method of entry, the location, the sexual nature of the attack, everything lined up. So to the Lakeland police, it looked like they might finally have their killer. There was only one problem. Ulmer died in a prison attack back in 1996. But investigators weren't ready to let it go. They reached out to Ulmer's mother, obtained a familial DNA sample, and compared it to the DNA from Linda's rape kit. The results came back a few weeks later. No match. The DNA wasn't even close. For detectives, it was a crushing blow. After 20 years of chasing leads, this one seemed to fit perfectly, and now it was gone. So once again, the trail went cold. By 2005, the Lakeland Police Department had formed a new cold case unit, and even the FBI joined the effort by repeatedly running the killer's DNA through national databases. But year after year, no match ever surfaced. So detectives began to fear the worst, that whoever murdered Linda Slaten might already be dead. By 2018, it had been nearly 4 decades since Linda was murdered. Her sons were grown men, now husbands, fathers, grandfathers. But the pain of losing their mother in such a brutal way never left them. For years, they lived with the same question: would this ever be solved? Then almost out of nowhere came a new kind of hope. That year, the field of forensic genetic genealogy was changing everything about how cold cases were solved. After the Golden State Killer arrest, police departments across the country began submitting decades-old DNA samples to private labs, hoping to trace unidentified suspects through their family trees. In Lakeland, detectives decided to take a chance. They sent the preserved DNA sample from Linda's 1981 rape kit to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company pioneering this new technology. One of the lead genealogists on the case was C.C. Moore. a name now synonymous with solving the unsolvable. When she learned about Linda Slaten's story, she made it personal. Cece was determined to help those two little boys, now grown men, finally find out who killed their mother. By June of 2019, Cece Moore took the anonymous DNA profile from the rape kit and uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. From there, she began building a genetic family tree, branch by branch, using distant relatives who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown suspect. Cece pored over records for hours: birth certificates, death records, marriage licenses, and old newspaper clippings. Cross-referencing family connections with social media posts and online databases. It was, as she described it, like assembling a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the box. As the tree took shape, 3 distant genetic networks began to emerge. Separate branches that, when connected, pointed toward one family line in Florida. And within that family, there was only one biological son who fit the right age, location, and genetic markers. His name, Joseph Clinton Mills, Coach Joe. After hundreds of leads, false starts, and nearly 40 years of dead ends, Cece Moore had identified the man she believed was Linda Slaten's killer, and she did it in just one weekend. To detectives, the name sounded familiar. Even though the case had passed through generations of investigators, Joseph Mills appeared in the old case file. He'd been interviewed the day after the murder, not as a suspect, but as a potential witness. Back in 1981, Mills was just 20 years old, a local youth football coach who volunteered with the neighborhood kids, including Linda's son, Tim. And the day before Linda was killed, Mills had driven Tim home from football practice. Hours later, Linda was dead. The original detective spoke with Mills briefly over the phone, asking where he'd been that night. It was a short, casual conversation. Never in person, never followed up on. At the time, Mills seemed harmless, a friendly coach helping out this struggling single mom, so he was never considered a suspect. Now, nearly 4 decades later, his name was back, and this time, detectives were certain they were looking at the right man. Even better, he was still alive. After all of these years, there was finally a chance for answers and justice. As investigators dug deeper into Mills' past, they learned that in 1984, just 3 years after Linda's murder, he'd been convicted of grand theft for forging a will. He never served jail time, but during the court process, Mills was fingerprinted, and those records included not just fingerprints, but also a palm print. So detectives pulled out the old print cards from storage and compared them to the partial palm print found on Linda's bedroom windowsill back in 1981. It was a match. The same hand that had pressed against Linda's window that night belonged to Joseph Mills. Forensic genetic genealogy had already linked him through DNA, but this physical evidence was the final piece of the puzzle. But even with everything they had so far, the police needed more. They needed to be 100% sure this was their guy. So after that, they launched round-the-clock surveillance, following Mills everywhere he went. He was living quietly in Kathleen, Florida, just 30 minutes from the original crime scene. He owned a small trucking business, been married for years, and was now a father and grandfather. To anyone who knew him, he looked like an ordinary man living an ordinary life. For days, investigators watched and waited for something, anything he might discard that could hold his DNA. But he was careful. It was almost like he already knew the police might be onto him. But finally, detectives decided to take a more direct approach. They retrieved Mills' entire trash can, loaded it into a police vehicle, and brought it back to the station. Inside, they found a used piece of adhesive tape, which was sent to the crime lab for testing, and days later, the results were in. The DNA on the tape was an exact match to the DNA recovered from Linda Slaten's 1981 rape kit. After nearly 40 years, science had confirmed what Cece Moore's genetic tree had already revealed. Joseph Clinton Mills, the boys' trusted football coach, was their mother's killer. When detectives broke the news to Jeff and Tim, the room must have fell silent. The man who had once driven them to practice, who had comforted them after their mother's death, had been the one who took her life. On December 12, 2019, detectives finally made their move. They pulled up outside Joseph Mills' home in Kathleen, Florida, and slapped handcuffs on him. He was then led to the marked car waiting in the driveway. And as they began to drive to the Lakeland Police Department, detectives read him his Miranda rights. To some people's surprise, he didn't say a word. No protest, no questions, no emotion. According to the detectives who were with him that day, Joseph Mills was calm and cool as a cucumber, eerily composed for a man accused of one of the city's most haunting murders. At the police station, detectives sat across from Joseph Mills in the interrogation room. At first, Mills was calm and detached. He told investigators he didn't remember ever going inside of Linda Slaten's apartment. He said he might have seen her around the complex, but that was it. Then detectives laid out the forensic evidence. The DNA, the rape kit, the palm print. Every piece of it placed him inside of her apartment that night. That's when his story seemed to change. Mills suddenly claimed that what happened between him and Linda had been consensual. He told police he saw her open bedroom window that night and took it as an open invitation. He said they engaged in a sexual encounter and that the coat hanger around her neck, the one that was used to strangle her, was supposedly part of a sex game. According to Mills, Linda had asked him to do it. But detectives didn't buy a word of it. The forensic evidence and the circumstances told a very different story. They believed Mills targeted Linda. After dropping Tim off from football practice, he returned later that night. With Jeff staying at his grandparents' house and Tim and Linda attending a nearby party, investigators think Mills broke through the bedroom window using a hanger taken from her own closet as a weapon. In the final moments of her life, Linda had tucked her boys safely into bed, said goodnight, and walked to her room, completely unaware that her killer was already inside waiting for her. There was no invitation, no game, no consent, just a violent assault and a senseless murder. On February 9th, 2022, Joseph Clinton Mills pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, sexual battery, and burglary, a deal that spared him the death penalty. At the sentencing hearing, Linda's sons, Jeff and Tim, finally had the chance to face him. They spoke about their mom, about the fear and the pain that he caused. But Mills refused to look at them. And when it was his turn to speak, he stood before the judge and said that he was a good person. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Just like that, after nearly 40 years, the case was finally closed. For Linda's family, it wasn't full justice. They wanted him to explain why. They wanted remorse, or at least the truth. But Mills, Coach Joe, never apologized and never gave him a reason. He had lived almost 4 decades as a free man. He got married, raised children, and built a life, while Linda Slaten's sons grew up without their mother. Now he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will never hurt anyone again. And while nothing can undo what was taken that night in 1981, for Jeff and Tim, there's finally some peace in knowing that their mother's killer will never walk free again. The murder of Linda Slaten is a powerful reminder of why preserving forensic evidence matters, even when justice feels out of reach. For nearly 40 years, a single palm print and carefully sealed rape kit held the truth. And thanks to science of forensic genetic genealogy, the truth finally came to light. Because sometimes it isn't new evidence that solves a case, it's new technology and the determination to never stop looking. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Sherry A., Nicola, Megan G., Urelli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Lois B., Lynn H., Danielle D., Lucretia W., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Courtney C. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.